the topic on the syllabus was sort of an overview of Jewish history through biblical and rabbinic literature. I'm actually curious, before we dive into what I have prepared, I'm curious to just hear from everyone here, what do we feel like our knowledge is of, if somebody says overview of Jewish history from biblical to rabbinic literature, is that something that we have 0% knowledge of? Is that something that people feel like, oh no, I actually have a nice, timeline in my head? I'm curious, like where we're starting from here. So any and all answers.
I feel like we're coming from not having much knowledge on, I think I can speak for the kids and I mean, I do have some, but it's been so long. So yeah, so that's where we're coming from.
Perfect.
And mine's about the same.
Awesome. Naomi, were you going to say something? I see you. We're talking.
I was just saying, yeah, we're like, we know the basic stuff about like Moses and parting the Red Sea, but do you have anything you want to say,
Not really. I mean, there's kind of a timeline, more or less, but I mean,
or like
not
why,
too much in-depth
I know
stuff.
like why they ate matzah and stuff, but yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so let's make this more conversational, because I think anyway that'll be more interesting, and we'll have some sources to sort of guide us. I want to start off by throwing out a distinction here, and I'm really curious to hear some ideas, and we'll start a little bit more academic, and then we'll get into more practical, for lack of a better term. One of the things that's really interesting, so I know a couple of weeks ago, whenever we had the first session, we spoke a lot about the multifaceted nature of Judaism, right? So the idea that Judaism has part religion, part ethnicity, part nationality. One of the other really interesting distinctions that I just want to start by throwing out there is what historians or a lot of Jewish thinkers call the difference between history and memory. And I think it's a really interesting distinction to throw out there. And I'll give a brief summary of both, and I'll explain why I want to differentiate. And then I would love to hear people's thoughts on this. So when people use the term memory, obviously we all have some intuitive understanding of what the word memory means. But when we say Jewish memory, it means, how do Jews internally think about our history? And so one interesting way that I think comes to the forefront is exactly what you just said, Naomi, right? Like, if I say biblical Jewish history, like in your memory of ancient Jewish history, you think like, okay, splitting the sea and matzah, which is perfect, by the way, because that is Jewish tradition doing its job. Because one of the things that we'll see in a minute is that as a tradition, right, and this is true for all religious traditions and all different, ethnic and cultural traditions, but we'll keep this unique to Judaism here. There's a difference between what happened historically and what may or may not have happened, let's assume has happened, but we really want people to recall it often, right? And if you think about, right, your own childhoods or events in your life, it's the same way, right? To some extent, right, if you imagine major milestones in your life, right? First days of school, right? For some people, wedding days, right? The day your first child was born, right? Like any day in your life that's very important, that day is celebrated more often than other days, right? So we're all, right, we all recognize, right, you have anniversaries, you have birthdays and those things, right? But those days are no more a part of your history than other days. And so I wanted to start here to create two interesting distinctions. That one, Jewish memory to some extent is a reflective process. And we'll get into some sources in a minute. And if this isn't clear, let me know and we can go back and just review this again. But when something is a reflective process, and when we say memory, it means something that may or may not have happened in the Jewish past, but whenever we bring it up, we're not actually talking about the past. We're actually talking about the present and future. And so Passover is the prime example of that, right? So, Passover or the Exodus from Egypt ends up being one of the most central events in Jewish calendar. And it's actually not just Passover that we talk about the Exodus from Egypt. Every Friday night, for those who make Kiddush Friday night, we actually say in the Kiddush, we say Zecher Li'Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? A remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. For those who have ever seen tefillin that's being wrapped, or for those that have ever put on a talit, right? Traditional Jewish prayer shawl, right? a lot of the symbolism behind that is actually to remember the Exodus. And so Jewish tradition, when they want Naomi, your first thought to be, oh yeah, of course I know like Jewish history, right? Because of matzah, and right, I'm sure you have some memories at some point in your life eating matzah. That is Jewish tradition working, because Jewish tradition, and we'll see why in a minute, has decided, right, in my opinion, for good reason, that this is a period, right? This is an event that's worthwhile to have at the forefront of your mind. Therefore, we're going to constantly talk about it. We're going to create experiential education to reinforce it. And actually, every time you recall the Exodus from Egypt, we're not actually concerned with history. We're actually much more concerned with what's called working memory, because we want you to do something about that in the present. So just because you brought up Passover, right? When it comes to Passover, whenever we talk about the Exodus, we're not actually really talking about history, right? Like if the next time you started talking about Passover, somebody sat there with like a long chart of like, okay, well, it was Ramses II and then his son Ramses III, and like this is what the archaeological picture of the chariots looked like, you would all immediately fall asleep. And that wouldn't be a very conducive way to revolve an annual ritual like the Seder around, right? The Passover ends up being much more of an experiential occasion to mostly reinforce ideas about the present and future. And then the second way this is important, then I would love to hear some thoughts about this, and I can clarify if any of this seems to make no sense right now, is what happens when there's a difference in views between historical communities and religious communities. And especially to be a Jew in the modern world, right? Especially as people that are not, let's say overly dogmatic, right? So there's obviously one approach to religion that suggests that everything in religion or everything in Judaism is 100% true without a doubt. And if anybody comes to you and tries to challenge you on any component of biblical literalism, you push back, right? I would venture to guess that's not how many of us think, right? So if scientists say, let's pick a very easy, uncontroversial example, if cosmologists tell you that the Earth is actually 14 billion years old, I would guess very few of us are going to open up the book of Genesis and say, well, hey, wait a minute, this seems to imply it's 6,000 years old, right? And Jewish tradition for a long time hasn't been biblical literalist tradition. But to some extent, what we're saying with that distinction is when we're learning science and we're learning Judaism, we're not necessarily talking about the same thing, right? And so when we read the stories of Genesis, and we can get into some of the stories in a minute, but just to put this framework, and then I would love to hear some thoughts. When we read the stories of Genesis, perhaps we're actually more interested in some of the ideas and some of the ethics and some of the morals and perhaps even the philosophy that we can gain from this tradition. We're a lot less worried about whether or not it is historically factual or not. And so if you ask me, like, I'll speak personally, if you ask me whether or not I believe that 6,000 years ago, there was two humans in the world named Adam and Eve, or Adam and Chava in Hebrew, that lived in a garden called the Garden of Eden, I'll say, no, I don't believe that if you took a time machine 5,600 years ago, it was two humans alive talking to a snake in a garden, right? If you then ask me, do you believe the story is true? I'm going to say, yes, I believe the story is true. And so then at that point, right, lest you think I'm crazy and just run away at that point, if you say, well, what do you mean by that story being true? I'll say, I think that story uncovers profound truths about human nature. And I think that story uncovers profound ethics and morals about the way that we're supposed to act in the world. And it's providing a basis for a lot of fundamental ideas that I really value. That's what I mean by it's true. And so that's again, the distinction between history and memory, right? So if somebody asks me, historically, how was the world created, right? I'm going with the physicists and cosmologists. But if somebody asked me to talk about memory, right? Here's an example. This past week, I was at a wedding and I was helping officiate the wedding. And in Jewish weddings, you read a traditional Jewish marriage contract called a ketubah. And the first line of every ketubah is you say, on Sunday, right, in Jewish tradition, the first day of the week, and then you say 57, 80, whatever years from the creation of the world, right? And that is how every standardized ketubah marriage contract starts, by basically saying the world is 6,000 years old. And the reason why that hasn't been changed to some extent is because of this distinction of history and memory, that even though if you ask even the vast majority of extremely traditional Orthodox Jews what they think about cosmology and all of these things, they'll say, no, of course the world is billions of years old and the Torah might not have been literal there. But in terms of our memory and how internal Jewish tradition thinks about things, it's a lot more about the ideas. I'm curious, one, I want to ask two questions. One, does that distinction make sense? And feel free to say no, right? If it makes no sense at all, don't be shy. And two, what do you think of that distinction and how it applies to what you know about some of the basics of Jewish tradition?
It makes perfect sense to me. And I think it's true of not only Jewish tradition, but almost any religious tradition, because it kind of, you take your teachings and it changes as society changes over the ages.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. Naomi, what do you got? I'm going to pick on you.
I get what you're saying, like about the Adam and Eve thing, and then I think everything, I'm a slightly confused. I think it'll all make sense in a little bit though, more.
Perfect. I love that. Remind me your name, Naomi's brother.
Oh, Sean.
Sean, awesome. Cool.
What do you think?
I just need to know your name so I can pick on you later and call on you. But I won't do it now. I'll say that.
Well, I liked I liked the idea of, because yeah, I think many of us, or I have, looked back on stories and said, well, did that really happen? And was there really a snake? And maybe there was, I don't know. But to be able to just take the teachings of it, and just kind of learn from this greater story of it. I do like that.
Yeah, and I think I'll add to that. In my opinion, I think to some extent we do a disservice, I think, to people when we don't make that distinction, in the sense of, right, a typical trajectory, right? Just because I spend 99% of my time working with college students that come from, all different factions of the Jewish community. And this is like a very stereotypical, right, average picture of what a lot of them tell me when, if and when we study any Torah together, is, oh yeah, I remember learning that when I was studying for my bar bat mitzvah. I learned the story when I was 8 or 10, and I've never really revisited it. And I've always thought it was kind of foolish, right? Which makes perfect sense, because if we have the same understanding into adulthood as we do when we're 10, right? I think all pieces of literature would seem a little bit foolish. But also that distinction is key to some extent, because nobody would read. I mean, even we could think of a modern example. Naomi or Sean, I don't know what grade you guys are in, but I remember, I think in 9th grade when I was in high school, we read the book 1984 by George Orwell. I'm curious, shake your heads if you read it or not. Okay, perfect. Well, you will one day. So just a brief summary of 1984 is George Orwell's writing sometime in the 50s and 60s, and he's writing about the dangers of a lot of things, but specifically he's writing about the dangers of if government takes over and strips all citizens of their freedom. And there's some other critiques there and whatever, and he's writing this book about the future, right? Because he's writing this in the 1960s about a fictitious situation in the year 1984 where the government has taken over. And right, it's probably one of the most important books that has been written in the last 100 years in English. And you could imagine, I think it was actually translated into English. So you could imagine somebody in the year 1985 getting up there and saying, well, we should all throw out these books, right? The year 1984 came and went, and this prophecy never came true. And from our vantage point, that would seem like the most foolish thing somebody can do, because the whole point of this book was not to create an accurate historical or futuristic prediction of what a year would look like. It's to, again, challenge a community with a certain type of ideas and say, if we don't worry about this, this is something that can happen. And this can be applied, and I think has to be applied to virtually, a lot of stories in Jewish tradition. And I'll just keep on the Exodus example, just because Naomi, you brought it up, right? Like what happens, and this is something that's actually happened in the last 100 years, if archaeologists show up and they say, well, hey, we are actually beginning to challenge the literal assumption of the Torah that 600,000 people left Egypt in an ancient slave revolt 3,400 years ago. And to some extent, if you were to say at that point, well, let's just throw the whole book of Exodus out, it's no longer important. To some extent, that's the same approach as throwing out the book 1984 in the year 1985, because see, the story never happened, right? What the Torah is trying to bring us, and one of the reasons why I wanted to start off with history and memory, is the Torah is a lot more interested in moral truths than it is in historical truths. And I think what gives a religious tradition its power to continuously be relevant is trying to focus on a status quo situation and try to challenge us to change it, right? So with the Exodus, it's obvious, right? The Exodus is the first really story in human history where God cared about the underdog. And one way to think of this, and we can do some text in a moment if people are interested, but one way to think of this is if we were alive in the ancient world, right? Let's say you got in a time machine and you popped in anywhere 3,500 years ago, right? It doesn't matter if you were in ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia or Greece or anywhere else, right? China, and you were to go observe society. All societies back then were one, hierarchical systems. And so you were born into a certain position, and no matter what you can do, you were not getting out of that position. And some people were born into the lowest class, which was slaves, right? People who weren't able to own anything, people who owed their life to somebody else to some extent. And the upper class were gods. And when I say gods, I don't mean that I believe they were actually gods. I mean, if you look in all ancient texts, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, believed himself to be a god. The king of Assyria believed himself to be a god, right? Chinese rulers believed themselves to be a god, right? And to some extent, this, right? You can imagine a society based off of, well, if my father's the king and then he passed away and now I'm the king, right? I'm the king because I'm part God. And if somebody on the other side of my village grows up and his father's a slave, well, he's a slave and I owe nothing towards that person because, well, I'm a god and he's a slave, right? And we were born that way. And so obviously, right, divine justice had it so that he deserves to be working as a slave his whole life and I deserve to be a god my whole life, right? That was the situation for the vast majority of human history in the vast majority of cultures. And what the Exodus story does, right? Again, way past conversations about what were the names, what are the dates, have we found any archaeological evidence, right? What's the history, right? This story takes that situation and subverts it, right? All of a sudden, there's a new god on the block to some extent, to be a little bit, comedic, right? And the whole point of the Torah is to introduce a new concept in world history, really, which is a concept that, we can call it monotheism, but more precisely, ethical monotheism. And what ethical monotheism teaches is in line with Genesis, right? One of the most important texts that I think we have, it says that humans were created in the image of God. And there's no limits there, right? So all of a sudden, there's now one God, and all humans are created in the image of God, which today, hopefully in America, we all hear that and we say, well, of course, all humans are equally intrinsically important and holy and valuable. But 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, that was a radical statement. Like, what do you mean? The slave in the corner of your village was equally created in the image of God as me, the king, right? That makes no sense. I'm king and that's a slave. And so then the Torah goes one step further. The foundational narrative of Judaism, right? We go from individuals, right? And we can do a couple texts in a minute, right? We go from, right, individual people who had relationships with this one God, right? Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, right? The 12 sons, right? We sort of have to some extent an overview of biblical characters, and I can give a list in a minute. But one of the things that I'm trying to push is that it's far more important than any individual. It's really about the ideas. And all of a sudden, our tradition takes a turn, and we end up being slaves in Egypt, And this is also crazy, by the way. And I'll say two more things, then we'll take some time for comments or questions or thoughts. Because all ancient peoples in the ancient world, if you are going to try to write down your history, you're going to write your history down as being, godly, heroic characters, right? So if you read the history that some of the Greek leaders wrote about themselves, it was, we are the best people on earth, and we descend from gods, and we descend from warriors, and all of these things. All of a sudden, now there's a new story, right? The story is there's one God. That one God creates all humans in the world. That very fact gives all humans a moral responsibility towards each other, because if we were all created in the image of God, that means two important things. One, it means that we're all important. Two, it means that none of us are more godlike than the other. So no longer can I claim, oh, hey, I'm God, you're not, sorry. That's why I get to enjoy all the luxury and wealth, and that's why you have to suffer your whole life. All of a sudden, right, that is no longer true. And then even more so, the foundational central story of the Torah is we were slaves in Egypt, and God comes and frees us. And now our entire tradition revolves around that idea. And actually the most common verse in the entirety of the Torah, I think it says it 36 times, but depending on how you count, you could even get higher accounts, says something along the lines of, you were slaves in the land of Egypt, therefore you shall not, sometimes it says you shall not treat the stranger badly. Sometimes it says you shall not harm a foreigner. Sometimes it says you shall not be too haughty, right? Don't be too cocky, because realize that, your fortunes at one point in history weren't too great also, right? And so all of a sudden, we're creating an entire new framework by which to view the world. And a framework that I would argue has affected and bolstered far more than just the Jewish community, right? In a lot of ways, right? All of a sudden, we now view, right? There's one God, that God created everyone and everything. Given that God created everyone and everything, nobody's inherently better than the other. And even more so, because God created everyone and everything, if there are people that are suffering more than other people, it means that you actually have a moral responsibility to lift them up. Because otherwise, the whole tradition makes no sense. And so Jewish tradition takes that and says, okay, we have some very important ideas here, right? We have some very important ideas here that to some extent, it doesn't matter which elements of the history of slavery and exodus in Egypt are exactly historically true, which are spot on, which ones would be taught in a history class, which ones might have some embellishment, which ones archaeologists say, well, sorry, that part actually never happened, right? We've never found a giant golden calf, right, under the desert in the Sinai, right? To some extent, all of these questions, right, they might be interesting. And if we were, talking about archaeology, I can excitedly tell everybody about the different theories and the debates that archaeologists have. But from a traditional Jewish perspective, that doesn't matter. What matters is that every year you gather with your family or friends, you eat matzah. While you're eating the matzah, you say, well, gee, right, life must be pretty terrible for people that this is all they get to eat, right? You eat maror, right, bitter herbs. Nowadays, our bitter herbs isn't as bad as I think it used to be, right? Now we just seem to eat lettuce, but you eat bitter herbs, it's awful. And you say, wow, I'm really starting to understand, right, what it's like to live a life that isn't comfortable. And then you're reading stories of servitude in Egypt and of real suffering and oppression that happened to us in our history. And hopefully through doing that year over year, and right, obviously there's more to the Jewish calendar than just the Exodus, you attune yourself to a certain understanding of the world. And all of a sudden now, right, you're not becoming an amateur historian for one night a year or for 1 week a year on Passover. You're becoming, hopefully your philosophical and ethical responsibilities are heightened, and the imperative that you have towards the rest of the world is heightened. And you realize that you actually have a job to do, right? And that the goal of religion and Judaism is not to sit back and say, I wonder what's next, right? I wonder what new law I have to keep, or I wonder what's holidays next on the calendar. You actually realize, oh my God, I actually have to do something, right? The world in some way actually needs me. And just like God in the Torah goes out and helps people, perhaps I also have a responsibility to help people. And so through this framework, again, and we can view that perhaps a lot of things in Judaism and in the Torah through this framework. I'm curious to pause for a minute. One, to say hi to Yoni. I see you popped in the middle there. And two, I'm curious to hear thoughts, pushback, questions, any and all.
Well, what I like is, thinking outside of yourself, right? So like I have a moral responsibility to help others who are less fortunate, like that really, I really like that. And I think it's important to remember history because we live in a lot of comforts that I think we just naturally take for granted because that's all we know. So anyway, so I do like that.
Yeah, I think you do now. And to some extent, just to add, and then Sean, I'm going to pick on you. I'm going to give you a forewarning. A lot of what we do on the Jewish calendar, right, can also be viewed through a similar lens. I mean, Passover is sort of the obvious one, but right, let's pick the other long holiday. That's one of the Shalosh Regalim, right, considered the three major holidays, at least in biblical times, right? Sukkot, which happens every year, right around September, October time, is typified by leaving your house and living in a hut called the sukkah for a week. And to some extent, the morals and ethics, and I think at a later time, I think Rabbi Marcia will do major Jewish holidays, but this holiday is typified by quite literally, you're supposed to leave your house and eat and sleep in a small hut that's usually outside your house called the sukkah. And so on the one hand, right, this seems a little ridiculous and it's always comical, and it's a funny Jewish holiday. I think it's also a very creative one, but the ethics and philosophy behind it are exactly the same, right? The historical or the memory reason that's given for this is to understand what it was like when the Israelites were traveling through the desert, right? So to continue the story, right? We go down to Egypt, we spend some time there, God frees us, right? As Naomi said before, God splits the sea. Then we go to Mount Sinai, we receive the Torah, and then there's 40 years of wandering. And the Jews, right, while they were wandering, right, the idea goes, well, they have to be living somewhere. So let's imagine they were living in huts, or perhaps God was protecting the Jews and creating some sort of abode for them while they were in the desert. So every year we go outside and we commemorate that. But also through an ethical framework, it means that once a year, we are leaving our houses and we're living outside. And that does two important things. One, I think it reinforces a lot of what we take for granted, that material possessions to some extent are temporary. And that even if, right, we all have the luxury in sleeping in a nice house with, air conditioning or heat, right? I guess in California, it's not as extreme as you can imagine it was in, medieval Europe, when in October you're sleeping outside for a week. But we can all, right? So not to be too drawn to material possessions, but also it forces you, right? If you spend a week sleeping in a temporary hut that's on the street, perhaps you become more attuned to next time you're walking down the street and you see somebody who's living for 365 days on the streets. And so again, this framework over and over again reinforces, right? Jewish tradition takes history, right? Takes events in the past and has rituals and holidays that allows us to relive those events, but not because we necessarily care about you being an expert in ancient Mesopotamian history, but because we care that you are a member of a community today that's always paying attention, that's always trying to, again, better the world to some extent. Anyway, Sean, what are your thoughts?
Honestly, since you explained that, I think it makes like just a lot more sense. Like when you mean by it's not necessarily literal, it's just like more like the Torah is trying to impart on morals on you more than history. I think that's like a really, really interesting, and I honestly really never thought of it that way.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, and it's one of the things that becomes, right. So the next step here which, right, maybe will get us into some sources. I have this whole source sheet and I keep thinking, well, one of these minutes, it'll make sense to crack that out, but we'll see if that ever happens. I have a really bad personal tendency at like putting together like 19 pages of material and then never touching it. It's always funny because I had a rabbi when I was in college, so about 10 years ago, and he was like this, like he was an absolute genius. He was like this older man. He was probably 75 when I was a freshman. And he just had like, just crazy encyclopedic knowledge about everything. And he would go into like, our class that we had in the Hillel building, and he would give us each of these like packets that were like 25 pages. I'm like, this was going to be for like a 45-minute like conversation, like over lunch, right? From like 12:30 to 1:15, right? Like not enough time to cover even like one page of material. He would give us these 25-page packets and then start on a complete tangent. And then with 5 minutes left, he would always say, oh my God, we didn't get to the material. Let's start reading. And then it'd be like 5 minutes past. And like, it was always like everybody knew that whenever you had any interaction with Rabbi Chaim, it was going to go at least an hour overtime. So like, if you were going to show up, you just did not plan anything after. And then like an hour and a half after class ends, he would always look at his watch and be like, oh my God, like, is this past? Are we past the end time? So I've tried not to learn too many bad habits from him. And don't worry, I won't keep everyone here till far past or anytime. Yeah, go for it, Dina.
I have a question. So you said this, I know this is a really novice question, but you said when the Jews received the Torah, is that different from when the Jews received the 10 Commandments, or is that the same event?
It's a great question, and it's totally not a bad novice question, because Jewish tradition's a little bit confused on that question. So you're actually touching on a really interesting tension, I guess, in a lot of our sources. So like very basic, I'm very bad at giving like yes or no answers, which maybe is something you learn about me. It's probably a bad thing. So from the biblical account, right? Like, so if we opened up the book of Exodus now, or the book of Shemot in Hebrew, and try to, what does it literally say? It says the 10 Commandments. And so if you look, right, so just to paint the picture, just to do like a little bit of, I guess, the story, right? So we discussed before, right? If we're going to summarize the Torah in 1 minute, right? So we have Genesis, the world was created, right? The book of Genesis is a story of individuals, right? We then focus in on Abraham, who is considered the first person to have the realization that there's one God, and that one God is a God that demands ethics and morals, right? We just discussed that. Abraham then, right, and his wife Sarah ends up having a child, Isaac. Isaac and his wife Rebecca end up having another child, Jacob. Jacob has 4 wives, right? And they have 12 sons, right? Those 12 sons end up becoming 12 tribes, right? Those 12 tribes eventually descend down to Egypt. They spend a couple hundred years in Egypt. Then we have the Exodus. Jews march out of Exodus. They go right to Mount Sinai, which is somewhere between Egypt and Israel, if we were to open up a map right now. And Moses then goes up on Mount Sinai for 40 days. He comes down with the tablets, right? There's the whole story of the golden calf, right? He ends up smashing the first ones and has to go back up and get the second one. But Jewish tradition imagines, right, and later sources talk about this, that not only did Moses get the 10 Commandments on Sinai, he also received the entire Torah. That's also a very tough point to digest, because that story is taking place in the Torah. And so there's sort of a paradox at play, and Jewish tradition tries to reconcile those views. But so from a literalist perspective, Moses gets the 10 Commandments. Generally, people think of it, and Jewish tradition thinks about it as Moses received the Torah on Mount Sinai. But it actually is a really great question, because it is a point of confusion. Okay, so I want to just spend a couple minutes filling in the rest of the story of biblical history, and then we will do a couple of sources. And so, right, everything we've discussed so far gets us through. We have the book of Genesis and then the book of Exodus. And for the rest of the Torah, the Israelites are wandering through the desert. So if you ever open up the book, like the second half of the book of Exodus or Shemot, or the books of Leviticus or Numbers or Deuteronomy, all of those books are taking place in the 40 years of the wandering in the desert. And their stories, right? A lot of the stories are building the portable temple that was around in the time of the desert, right? Called the Mishkan in Hebrew. The stories are where we learn most of the laws about the holidays, and it's where we learn about Shabbat, which we'll discuss, and where we learn about the laws of kosher. And so most of what we know to be like, you know, the basics of Jewish life, right? So if somebody were to ask you, well, why don't Jews eat pork? Right? Obviously, we can try to tease out a philosophical or historical reason, but most literally, we don't eat pork because it says in the Torah, right, thou shalt not eat pork. It doesn't actually literally say that, but right, to some extent, thou shalt not eat pork, or don't mix meat and milk, or every Saturday, right, celebrate Shabbat. The Torah then ends on almost a cliffhanger, right? This is why you know the Torah is a great piece of literature, because famously the Torah does not end with the Israelites crossing into the land of Israel. The Torah ends on the bank of the Jordan River, right? The Jordan River is what separates, in modern day, Israel from Jordan, right? It's a massive river that runs up straight across, right, north to south. And the Torah ends on the banks of the Nile, getting ready to cross over. Which I think is a really interesting ending point. And I'll say two things about this, and then in a little bit we'll get into some sources here, where this distinction, one, I think one of the chief messages of the Torah is trying to be extremely process oriented. I'm trying to think how to summarize it, but the idea, and I think that this is a profound idea of Judaism, and really a lot of moral and religious traditions, is that the work is never actually fully accomplished, right? We always have more work to do. And even the Torah doesn't end going into the promised land, it ends almost getting into the promised land. And there's two different ways to have a religious framework of the world. And you know, I'm happy to dig into this distinction as much as people want, but there's a danger in religion, right? Probably not what you expected in a introduction to Judaism or religious class, but there's a real danger that a lot of religions, and Judaism is not an exception to this rule, can possibly fall into. And it's the danger of, you know, we can call it messianic thinking, right? We can give it whatever term we want, but the danger is to think that all of the work we need to do is already finished, and that we're living in end times, and the goal of everything that we're doing is to get to a very specific point, and then all the work is done, and okay, you know, we've succeeded. And the other way to approach religion is to view it as a constant motivating factor, right? There's always progress to happen, right? There's always more we can do. And Judaism very much tries to push the second one, right? And even right in any sense, right? One of the things that Jewish tradition teaches is that God is infinite, right? Just as a little tagline of Jewish philosophy. Now, if something is infinite, right? Anybody who's taken a math class knows, right? That means there's always more you can build up to it, right? Like you never reach infinity, right? You can start counting now. Doesn't matter if you have 800 years, right? You're never going to get to infinity. And so there's never a time where, right, it's not like Judaism and Jewish tradition says, well, do X, Y, and Z, and then bam, you're done. And so the Torah ending off, about to cross into the land of Israel, right, really personifies this. The second thing I'll say, this is actually, right, one of the most famous speeches of the last 100 years, right, also hops on this metaphor. And to get to everything we were talking about before, about the moral power of the Torah, especially if we don't view it literally, but view it for its ideas, right? Probably the most famous speech in America in the last 100 years is Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, I've been to the mountaintop. And this is a speech he delivered just days before he was assassinated. And his speech is using off this metaphor from the book of Deuteronomy. And if you haven't listened to the speech, I highly recommend it. One, of course, it's a extremely historically influential and important speech. Two, I think it's one of the best pieces of Torah commentary that's ever been produced to some extent. And he talks about a lot of situations in this country as he's saying, there's been progress, and yet there's always more to do. And so the sort of symbolism of going to the mountaintop and looking ahead and being forward-looking is something that Jewish tradition really takes to heart. And so the Torah, just to summarize, The Torah is not an end, right? The Torah is very much a beginning. And I do want to do at least one source real quick, and then we can discuss it. Let me just scroll down to find it. And we'll see. Naomi, can I ask you to read the source?
Yeah. They told a parable to what it can be compared to a flesh and blood king who had 2 servants, and he had a great love for them. And he gave each one a cob of wheat and each a bundle of flax. The wise one took the flax and wove a nice tablecloth, and took the wheat and ground it, sifted it, kneaded it, baked it, and set it on the table, and put the fine tablecloth on it, and left it until the king should come. The foolish one did nothing. After a time, the king came and said to his 2 servants, "My sons, bring me what I gave you." One of them took out the bread of fine flour with a fine tablecloth, and one of them took out the wheat in a box and a bundle of flax. Woe for such a shame! Woe for such embarrassment! Which one was more beloved? I would say the one who took out the bread and the table with the fine tablecloth. So too, when God gave us the Torah to Israel, he gave it only as wheat to make fine flour and flax to make a cloth.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Naomi. So this ends up being, I'll just say a little bit about this source that we just read, and then we can discuss it. This is one of the most important sources, I think, in Jewish tradition. This source comes to us through rabbinic literature. So the source was written, let's say, 1800 years ago. But this is the dominant philosophic framework that Jewish tradition has used to approach the Torah. And so what Naomi just read, just to give it a brief summary, is you can imagine a king who grants, a gift to 2 of his most beloved citizens or servants. And this king gives a bunch of wheat and flax to these 2 different people. And so you can imagine 2 different approaches, right? What happens if a king who's obviously very powerful gives you a gift? And so one approach says, well, this king obviously, right, really appreciates the flax and wheat. Let me just try to protect it, right? Let me take the wheat and flax and I'll keep it in a box and I'll ensure that nobody touches it and I'll keep it preserved for the king. A second person takes the wheat and says, you know what? If I sift this and grind it and bake it, I can make a beautiful bread. And if I take the flax and I cultivate it, I can weave a beautiful tablecloth. And he takes the raw material and creates something beautiful. And then the king comes back and says to the second servant, oh my goodness, what a beautiful tablecloth and what a beautiful meal. Thank you so much. And he shows up to the second servant's house and he says, well, what did you do with what I gave you? And the servant says, well, I've kept it. I've kept it with you for the last year or however long it's been. And what this source says is, right, that would be a very shameful servant at that point. And the analogy here is to Jewish tradition's approach to the Torah. And this is true in regards to our understanding of these stories. This is true when it comes to our understanding of the way that Jewish law functions, right? This is true for virtually everything in the Jewish tradition. That the point of the Torah and Jewish law and all of these ideas is to provide us with the raw material, not to give us everything we need. And so this is Jewish tradition. And again, this is not a modern source, right? This is not somebody writing this, 50 years ago when they were arguing for a non-literal interpretation of the Torah. This source is 1800 years old, right? And probably the sentiments go back, right, even 2000, 2500 years old. This is suggesting that the goal of being an active member of the Jewish community is not saying, well, I'm going to take all of the materials of Judaism, be it the ideas, the laws, all of this, and I'm going to safeguard it, right? The goal of being an active member of a Jewish community is taking the raw materials, be it the narratives, the laws, the philosophy, and I'm going to use that as raw materials, and I'm going to be creative, right? And I'm going to create something out of it. This is why, just as an aside, this is why there's so many different types and forms of Jewish practice. And in Jewish tradition, as opposed to a lot of other religious traditions, it's not considered a bad thing that there is a multiplicity of practice, right? There's a reason why there's a stereotypical joke that you have 2 Jews and 3 opinions. because in some way, right, if I were to hand everybody here a bunch of wheat, assuming we had any idea how to turn wheat into dough, everybody here would come up with wildly different things, right? One person's making a cake, the other one spaghetti, the other one bread, the other one, right, muffins, right? There's a lot of different things you can do with raw materials. And so too Judaism, right? The goal of Jewish tradition is to provide a basis and a scaffolding that then you can be creative with. And so this is, right, everything we've discussed about the Torah and about memory, and to some extent the idea, right, these foundational ideas are not to keep them neatly preserved. And to some extent, this is saying that it would be a bad thing, right? If we took Jewish tradition and we tried to preserve it, right? If you could imagine, right, a museum is what happens when things are preserved, right? And a museum, right, if you just imagine this analogy, when something's put in a museum, right, it's frozen in time, it's set in stone, right? People don't interact with it, right? The number one thing you're told at a museum is don't touch, right? And when something goes into a museum, right, it sits there, and perhaps it's an interesting, thing to visit once a year, and perhaps historians are interested in visiting museums for research, but it hardly is something that you're interacting with on a daily basis and changing your life in the world in some way. And so this source is saying one of the primary goals of Jewish tradition is to not museumify Judaism, right? We're trying to create a living tradition that is full of interaction and full of all these ideas based off of these original stories. And so I want to do one more story. This will be the last source we do today, just because this is the most radical source in Jewish tradition. And so I figured if we're doing a big, to some extent asking to do an overview of Jewish history is nearly impossible, because there's about 4,000 years of Jewish history. So I'll give a brief overview right after the source, because I think we still have about 30 minutes. But I want to just do this radical source just to get a little bit of the philosophy down of how Judaism functions in terms of history before we do that. But before we go to the source, let's do a brief overview, and then we'll go back to the source if we have time. Before we do that, any questions about what we just read? The sort of metaphor of the wheat is really one of the most central Jewish philosophic pieces. Okay, so let me just paint a little bit of a picture here, and then we'll have a little bit of a conversation for the end. So the Torah ends, right, as the Israelites are about to cross into the land of Israel. The Israelites, right, in the next book after, right, the first book after the Torah is called the book of Joshua. In the book of Joshua, that's the story of going into the land of Israel and conquering it and spreading out. And then the rest of the Hebrew Bible, right? The Hebrew Bible has a number of terms, right? Sometimes you'll hear it being called the Tanakh, which is an acronym of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketubim. Sometimes you'll hear it being called the Hebrew Bible. Sometimes you'll hear it being called the Old Testament. Jews obviously don't typically call the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament, because old presupposes that there's also a new one. But technically the Christian Old Testament and the Jewish Hebrew Bible are actually the same texts, even though the ordering of the books are a little bit different, but that's an aside. And so the rest of the Hebrew Bible is full of stories of when the Israelites were living in the land of Israel, also called Canaan at times in the Hebrew Bible. And so this is a story of building the temple in Jerusalem and all of the ways in, right, all of the different holidays and how they would used to, right, a lot of the Hebrew Bible is about sacrifices, because ancient Judaism used to be a sacrificial tradition. And actually one of the ways in which Judaism evolved, and I think we'll probably discuss this in a future class, one of the big evolutions in Jewish history was going from a tradition rooted in Jerusalem around a temple that had animal sacrifices on the daily to a tradition now that you can be, Jewish in Irvine or Tustin, and nobody says, well, hey, wait a minute, why didn't you sacrifice a lamb last Passover, right? It's probably not a question you're going to get very often in your life. And so the rest of the Hebrew Bible is full of these stories, and then it's also full of, right, there's an interesting tension that comes about throughout the Hebrew Bible that I just wanted to mention here, which is a tension between organized religion. And when I say organized religion, I'm saying the worshiping at the temple with sacrifices, and the moral charismatic character of religion. because half of the other stories you get in the Hebrew Bible are what's called the books of the prophets. And so for those that have ever seen quotes or read any parts of, let's say, the book of Isaiah or the book of Amos or the book of Jeremiah or Ezekiel, right? All of those prophetic figures are really, if you actually go and read through their literature, are full of these characters going and critiquing what's happening in the temple and organized religion. And I actually want to do, I did prepare some sources there. So I want to read one quote, and I will explain why I'm bringing this up in a second. Let me share this. So this is the beginning of Isaiah, and here is what Isaiah says. So Isaiah was a prophet, one of the prophets that was around in the 7th century BCE. So this is, again, within the Hebrew Bible, and after they had already established a temple in Jerusalem, and there had already been a couple hundred years of consistent animal sacrifices in Jerusalem. So Isaiah says, again, 2,400 years ago, he says, 2,600 years ago, he says, "The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lamb and goats. When you appear before me, who has asked this of you, this trampling of my courts? Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Shabbats, and convocations. I cannot bear your worthless assemblies. Your new moon feasts and your appointed festivals I hate with all my being. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I am not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourself clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow." And he goes on and on. And one of the most interesting things about the prophetic tradition in Judaism is that it's included in the same book as the, I'll call it, institutional religious tradition. And so throughout the Hebrew Bible, we have this ongoing tension between, right, you could imagine the temple and the ethics, or the priests and the prophets, right, in another understanding of it. And the interesting thing is that this is something that a lot of traditions, but specifically Judaism, has been engaged in terms of this debate, right, that started 2,600 years ago, but continues to now, which is there's a problem that's inherent within human nature, and the problem cuts both ways. So I'll point both sides of the debate, and then I'll give what I think has been the dominant Jewish approach to save this. Problem number one is, if you do something over and over again, it becomes, right, you don't really have to think about it. It becomes routine. It becomes, by definition, less meaningful if you're doing the same thing over and over again. And right, a lot of times you fall into sort of automatic thinking, and at times it can even become corrupt and overly bureaucratic. And so from a psychological perspective, if we are doing the same thing every single day, if every single day we are, let's say, bringing sacrifices, if this was 2,500 years ago, or if every week we're celebrating the same Shabbat, there's a risk at not only it becoming stale and boring, there's also a risk of it becoming corrupted. Because anytime you have organized anything, then you need to create an institution around it. Every time you create an institution, you then have to create some level of hierarchy, right? You're going to have a synagogue. Well, you need a rabbi. Okay, well, then you need a director. Okay, well, then you need there to be money flow. Okay, well, then you need there to be people in charge. Oh my God, then you've just created the same hierarchy that we started off by talking about Judaism being against, right? Obviously not as bad, right? It's not saying the person in charge is the king and everybody else is servants, but to some extent, institutionalized religion can oftentimes fall into the trap of enforcing a lot of the same things that religion is trying to undermine. On the other hand, the way also what's true about human psychology is that humans are very bad at understanding ideas totally in the abstract, right? And even if humans are able to understand ideas in the abstract, it's very hard to get abstract ideas, right, and pass them down one generation to the next. And the only way to concretize abstractions is to actually use symbols and rituals that then requires institution, which then can oftentimes reinforce what can subvert those symbols and rituals. And so, right, all that's a very complicated way of saying, right, there's a tension here between how institutional to create a religious tradition and how completely untethered from anything to create a religious tradition. And the obvious answer is you need both. And so throughout the Hebrew Bible, you see a constant interplay of, there are full books throughout the Hebrew Bible that talk just about exactly how to offer which sacrifices on which day, right? If you are very bored sometime this week, open up the book of Leviticus to any page, right? It doesn't matter which page, and you will get detailed lists of which sacrifices to bring on which days and why. And this is how Judaism was practiced in some way for 800 years, right? Living in Jerusalem with the centralized temple. On the other hand, if you take the book of prophets, right, any of the prophets there, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Amos, right, any of them, and you open up to a random page, what you'll probably get, right, they do talk about some other things, but what you'll probably get is a critique of overly ritualizing Judaism. And so you have this tension here, or what you might call from a philosophical perspective, a dialectic, which is just a fancy way of saying you have two ideas that contradict each other that are supposed to interact and counterbalance itself to get to some third position that's somewhere in the middle. So you get this dialectic between traditionalism, right, rooted in the institution, and innovation, right, rooted in the moral spirit of religion and always being self-critical. And so the main thing that we get from a reading, right, if we're just to think about ancient Jewish history through a memory type perspective, right, that we opened up with, right, the Torah is about ideas, and the Torah is also about setting up a realistic framework as to how a community can thrive for the next really 3,000 years based off of these ideas. And that requires a very difficult balance between innovation and also tradition. And so one of the tensions that comes out in Jewish tradition, and one of the reasons why it's so rich, is that you really need both, right? You need the forces that are more traditional to balance out those that are more innovative. And if you lose one, right, to some extent, the tradition can't move forward, or can get overly stuck in the past, or can so quickly move off into the future and forget its bearings. And I think even a couple of weeks ago, one of the ways in which, when we were talking about what the definition of Judaism is, I think I gave the famous Greek thought experiment, the ship of I always forget the Greek thinker's name who proposed the thought experiment. And if I didn't say this here, then I can say it now, is, right, there was a Greek philosopher that proposed a thought experiment where you have a ship that is crossing the ocean. And you could imagine, I'm just going to make up a round number, you can imagine the ship is made up of 1,000 planks of wood, right? Massive planks of wood. And as a ship sails throughout the ocean, obviously you need to repair the wood on the ship because wood gets stale very quickly when it's in salt water. And so every day, let's pick another round number, 25 of the floorboards are swapped out for new ones that they brought as extra. And so this keeps happening for months. And the thought experiment goes, if after whatever amount of days it takes for that new ship to be made up of completely different parts as the initial ship, is it still the same ship or not? And it's a really interesting question, because on the one hand, you could say, well, from a literal perspective, it's not the same ship at all. Because if a ship, right, you can imagine, right, thinking about this in a very literal perspective, if that initial ship had all of their floorboards numbered from 1 to 1,000, and now all of the floorboards that are part of the ship are numbered 1,001 to 2,000, that's a different ship. On the other hand, when you're talking about the ship, if that ship left, I don't know, let's pick an interesting place. If that ship left Bali and ends up in New York, it's still the same ship. You're not going to say they took two different ships, right? It didn't matter, right? There's no point along that journey where you can say, well, now it changed. And so to some extent, Judaism is the same analogy, right? The Judaism that we practice today is obviously still Judaism. And obviously what they were doing 3,000 years ago was Judaism. Does that mean that there are any literal similarities? maybe some of the ideas, right? Perhaps probably not in the rituals, probably not in the culture, probably not in a lot of the philosophies, outlook of the world, but it's the same tradition, right? And so to some extent, we're moving along on that ship. And one of the reasons why it's an interesting thought experiment is that, one, if that ship never changed down any floorboards, it would sink, right? So it's a great analogy because it shows that you need change, right? If you don't have any change, right, the whole thing just sinks, right? There's no more ship. But if it changes too fast, right, there's another way to view the thought experiment. Let's say that ship docks at a harbor and they just completely renovate it and swap out all the floorboards, then most of you would probably say, yeah, this is a different ship at that point. And so if Judaism changes too quickly, at some point that ceases to be Judaism. And there have been times in our history where there have been movements that arose from within Judaism that today we say are not part of Judaism. The most obvious example is Christianity, right, which obviously started off from Judaism, right? Jesus and most of the early followers of Christianity were involved Jews in the first century. There's a lot of other examples. There's the Karaites and the Sabbateans and, all sorts of other peoples that started off from within the Jewish community and tried to change everything too quickly. And so we're given this constant balance between institution and abstraction and change and traditionalism. And one of the reasons why I think Judaism is so exciting is that we constantly have to maintain this balance, which also means that you get a lot of internal debates about how to maintain this balance. Let's stop now. I would love to hear questions, comments, thoughts, pushbacks, any and all points here. I see a bunch of blank stares. I was saying before, I got very used to the first year of COVID. So I guess 3 years ago was actually the first time I ever taught at UCI. And so I had 40 students. I think it was winter of 2021, or maybe I'm off by a year, and nobody had their cameras on and nobody unmuted themselves for the first 3 classes until they got to know me better. And so I would always ask questions and just radio silence. And I would sit here. And so I got very good at handling awkward Zoom silences. So, but I would love to hear some thoughts.
Well, I'm sorry. I have a question, and I don't know if it's okay to ask, but what do
It's definitely okay to ask.
Okay.
Well, whatever the question is.
What do Jews think about Jesus? What do they think he was? Was he a prophet? Was he just a guy? What is the thought?
Yeah, it's a really great question. The very short answer, and here I will give a short answer, happy to expound. He was a guy. He wasn't, right, from a traditional Jewish perspective, there was nothing, prophetic or saintly about him that differentiated him from anybody else. I would say medieval Jewish tradition started viewing him with a lot more of a negative lens, especially as the wider Christian world, right? One of the things that happened in medieval Judaism is Jews that were living in the Christian world were very heavily persecuted, and for specifically not accepting Christianity. And so Jewish sentiment towards Jesus turned even more negative there. But from just a baseline perspective, he was just, he was just a guy, right? And later on, he was viewed with increased hostility. So it's not like Islam, right? Islam takes a sort of middle road where Islam says, well, Jesus wasn't God, but maybe he was a prophet, or he was a prophet. But yeah, Judaism is pretty unequivocal that they reject any holiness or prophecy with Jesus. So yes, definitely not a unaskable question. Any other thoughts, questions, comments with any of this framework? We discussed a lot of ideas, and there is an irony. We did a couple of important texts, I think, but there is an irony of me talking about the idea that that abstract concepts are very hard to grasp without connecting it to something while talking about abstract concepts. So I do fully recognize the irony in what I was doing there. And to some extent, also, this is one of the interesting parts in Jewish tradition, and this will be think this will be a nice ending to a lot of what we discussed, is you see this tension a lot in terms of Jewish ritual and also Jewish philosophy to an extent when it comes to the thinking of idols. And one way to think about this is if you flip through the Hebrew Bible, right? Let's say you have, a free 30 hours and you just read the Hebrew Bible cover to cover. One of the ideas that you come across with the most frequency is an anti-idolatrous sentiment, right? If there's one thing you can say about the Hebrew Bible and Judaism, it's that it is against idolatry. So if you start to ask from a philosophic perspective, well, what's so bad about idolatry, right? Like if somebody wants to worship, a stick or a graven image, right? Why is that worse than being a bad person? Or like, what is the deal with that? And so a lot of Jewish philosophers teach that it's not that idolatry is bad. It's what idolatry represents what's bad. And what idolatry represents is the idea of trying to capture something that's infinite in something finite. And so it's the idea of almost, you can imagine this on we can just pick an emotion that, hopefully we're all familiar with, right? I'm sure at some point in our lives, we've felt love towards another person, right? Whether that be family member, romantic, right? Friendship, something, right? So you can imagine if somebody were to ask you, right? Try to paint a picture or try to build something concrete that somebody can look at that thing and fully understand your love for this other person. You would hopefully say, well, that's not possible, right? You can try, right? People have wrote love poems. People can obviously draw beautiful pieces of art. Anybody who's experienced love would say, well, that is insufficient to actually get to the concept. And so one of the problems with idolatry is the reducing of an idea that's infinite, God, into something that's finite, because it, by definition, limits that thing, right? If somebody were to say, well, I don't need to explain to you what love is, just read this poem, you were to say, well, you probably don't really understand what love is to some extent, right? Or you'd at least be skeptical, hopefully, of my methodology there. And so this is, of course, connected to that balance that we were talking before, because Judaism teaches that, right? Judaism is a very ritualistic tradition, right? So compared to, let's say, right, just because we were talking about Christianity before, one of the things that early Christianity did is Christianity was, to some extent, this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but Christianity was anti-ritual to some extent. And so Christianity taught that a lot of the rituals in the Torah were obsolete. Judaism takes a much more complex view of that, because Judaism teaches that ritual is important because you need to attach something concrete to abstraction, right? If you just teach in the abstract and don't have anything concrete, then those ideas aren't going to be able to latch onto everything. On the other hand, there's a danger in thinking that the ritual is the end in itself, right? Like if every year you eat matzah on Passover, just to go full circle to what we started off with, if every year while you're eating matzah and somebody says, why are you eating matzah? And your answer is, I don't know, it says I'm supposed to eat matzah, right? Like the important thing is to eat the matzah, right? You've to some extent missed the whole point of why you're eating matzah, right? The eating the matzah is almost the idol, and trying to represent this idea that obviously, right, the idea of fighting injustice and the idea of everything we discussed before can't of course be contained in a ritual, but matzah might be one way to try to depict it. But there's always going to be that gap between an idea and trying to depict that idea in concrete form. And so all of Jewish tradition, to some extent, is a dance between these ideas. Any last minute thoughts or questions? Yoni, it's great to see you.
Sorry, every time you guys have the shir, I'm davening Marv with Rabbi Tilchin's minions. So my apologies.
Oh, no worries at all. But it's great to see you for the last few minutes. Any comments?
I really wish they would start the shir a little bit later after the minyan. Then it'd be a lot easier.
Yes, I will talk to Rabbi Marcia. I think she is in charge of all things schedule wise.
It shouldn't come from me. It should come from your idea, not only from me.
Perfect. Any last minute thoughts, questions, concerns?
Can you just give me like a little bit, because I missed a lot. Can you just give me a little bit like what you went over, and then I can give you my thoughts on it also?
Sure. Let's do that after, because I don't want to re-go through it again. At least I don't want to hold people hostage for the next few minutes, but let's finish and then I'm happy to go over a little bit with you.
Okay.
And if not, we will see you all very soon. Thank you so much for this fun conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
That was really great. Thank you.
Yeah.
We're glad you came, Naomi. See you, Sean.
Bye.
Bye.
And thank you.
Of course. Yoni, are you living in Florida?
I'm sorry.
Do you live in Florida? I see the Hollywood, Florida.
Yeah, I'm living in here for the last 10 years. I'm actually from LA, originally born but raised. I think Rabbi Marcia told you originally. And
cool.
I'm divorced. I'm looking for a new shidduch, and I'm in process of making Aliyah to Israel. So
Oh, wow. So you're making Aliyah when?
hopefully within the next year. I have all my paperwork in, but I'm waiting for the approval.
Oh, wow. Okay. And how did you connect with Rabbi Marcia?
I know, even though I grew up Orthodox in essence, because Marcia knows this, is that I was in Ramah in California and Ohio for about 6 summers.
Oh,
So
wow.
I know about the conservative movement. I know what they represent. I'm very for the women's rights, even though I grew up in the Orthodox world with certain things that the Orthodox Judaism turned me off to. I do things more out of tradition of wearing my hat and jacket or whatever for davening, whatever, because it's the way I grew up, and I wear, a long coat and Shabbos because I come from Hasidic background, but it's all out of minog nusach, not lifestyle. And Rabbi Tilchin,
Where did you grow up? You grew up in LA?
I grew up in LA. Yeah.
Interesting. Where'd you go to like high school and stuff?
I wasn't always in yeshiva because of my learning disabilities. So I was in kindergarten through 2nd grade. I was in a conservative school through 5th. I was in public school, and then for high school I was also in a private school that wasn't Jewish either. And then I did technical college for graphic design.
Oh, interesting.
And then I was married for a little while, didn't work out. Was married to an abuser, didn't realize, and then all of a sudden I got divorced, whatever. And now I'm looking for a new soulmate. So I've been around the block.
Yeah, of
And,
course. Are you connected with like Jewish community? I mean, Hollywood, Florida is a very
Yeah, there
obviously
are many
Jewish
shuls
area.
here, but I started going to the conservative shul with Rabbi Gideon Holzog here in Florida because of one of my girlfriends who I grew up with from camp. Her name is Rebecca Weisbach, and she opened up my eyes to what the conservative world was, which I always knew. But again, a lot of the time, up until maybe about a month, 2 months ago, I was totally against the women's rights. When then my older sister, Nitzan, who grew up religious and then now hasn't been for about 30 years because my father had pushed her in Judaism, my mother had encouraged, and she took everything in the wrong way. So she actually totally went off the derech for a while and then ended up marrying a conservative man as a second husband. So yeah, I do believe in the women's rights in essence, but I still, daven from an Orthodox sitter or whatever, and I still keep kashrut and Shabbat. That's something I wouldn't let go. But in essence, I believe like in the women's rights, and then having them the opportunity, being able to put on, talit tefillin, for them to be able to read from the, from the Torah, be able to have aligot, be able to be chazan, to
Sure.
say the whole 9 yards. Which my mother would think I'm crazy, but in essence, I'm like, this is what I believe in now, and this is like what it should have been years ago. I'm assuming you grew up also conservative, correct?
I grew up Orthodox.
Oh, you're like, so then you're like me. You understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah. No, I grew up. I spent years in like yeshiva in Israel.
Where are you now?
Like physically,
Yeah, where do you live now?
I live in Orange County, California. Like I live near Marcia. That's how I know her.
So what shul do you daven in?
Well, I'm the rabbi for Hillel, so I sort of do my I'm with the students on Shabbat. But when I do go to a shul, funny enough, I switch off between Orthodox and Reform. Because
so you're like me. You're like the wandering Jew, the Jew of all traditions.
Yeah, listen, I think to some extent, a lot of Jews in the modern world are, pluralist by nature, right? I wouldn't call myself conservative or Orthodox or Reform, right? I'm a pluralist.
When people ask me what I am, that's the way I grew up. What I am now, I go to a conservative shul. Do I consider myself a conservative Jew? No. It just
yeah.
I like being just like you. I like being in the surrounding of it.
Yeah. And I think listen, I think all denominations have very good parts about them and very bad parts, right?
I think Rabbi Tilchin did tell you at that time that you only grew up the same way you did. Like she pointed that out when we first collaborated, and I didn't realize.
Well, it's really great to meet you. I'm glad that you're around. Do you feel like you have like?
I came into this class because just like you always want to learn something new. she kept dousing at me the fact, why are you here? You grew up, I come here because I like, just like you, to Makar people, to bring them closer to Yiddishkeit. You realize that the Gehillah that we're servicing, that we have in front of us, these 5 people tonight, whatever, literally grew up with a kluma ela of Yiddishkeit, and it's like you have to be able to feed it to them slowly for them to understand the facts of Yom Tov, for them to understand the aspects of Shabbos, for them to understand aspects of Kashrus, Halacha, Mina Shemayim, Mina Torah. Like it's stuff like this which they have no clue on really what everything is, because what did they grow up with? Kluma with nothing. If they grew up with something, it was very little. As they would call traditional aspects. So that's why it's people like you and me who come in from the firm world to basically say, we're really not that bad. Really, this is what it is, but you take it to whatever perception you want. Like there's no wrong or right answer technically in this case.
Yeah, 100%. What are you hoping to do like when you move to Israel?
I'm working full time now for a call center for a place called Arise, and their client is basically motor vehicle dealing with people for disabilities, for motive of transportation, for medical appointments and stuff like that. So I'll still be able to work out of Israel when I'm there. But my dream was to live in Eretz HaKodesh from the start, and so Rabbi Tilchin had actually connected me to a few of the people in the conservative world, with the conservative yeshiva, with Jeremy Siegel and the Evolutionary Minyan over there. And I've also been in touch with Rabbi Joel, who runs the conservative yeshiva. So it's like I'm also thinking about going for smicha. So it's like I'm dealing with a lot of things in one shot. But again, I'm just like you. You don't leave Orthodox Judaism. You can't run away from your blood, even though you join another community. You can't run away from what you grew up from.
No, of course. I also think, I don't know much about the conservative movement in Florida. I don't know much about Florida in general.
It's morally all the same type of how all the conservative shuls are.
No, but I'm just saying, I know in Orange County, California, which probably is very different than Southern Florida, the non-Orthodox communities skew a lot older in terms of who's
the shul that I'm at, because it's the only conservative shul here that's in Hollywood, is the same thing that you just said. It's the older.
I would say, there are probably in Florida. Again, I don't know much about Florida, but I've
already did research because I did it on the internet. Temple Sinai is literally the only conservative shul here that's in Hollywood, that's in the neighborhood that I use a scooter to get around the neighborhood with.
But I was going to ask, are there any progressive modern Orthodox?
There are Orthodox shuls. There are a ton of them here in Florida.
But any that are more right, because within modern Orthodox, right, you have there's a growing progressive movement within Orthodoxy.
My point is, I believe in the women's rights, and any Orthodox shul you go into, they won't allow the women to have aliyot, which is not right. And that's why that's one of the reasons why I won't daven there anymore, is because of the fact they don't give women opportunities. Like all the women from the frum shuls, as you and I grew up, where they don't get to participate except for one thing. And that's in saying, Kaddish Shema, Mourner's Kaddish. And then on top of that, even there was a restriction on that a man has to say it with you. Like the woman can't say, and see, that's wrong in this case. Yeah. And it just that's considered against equal rights. Rabbi Tilchin basically represents 5 pointers, which I actually agree with, and the fact of it that women rights, women equalism, women opportunity, inclusion, participation. So it's even from all the articles that she writes on Erev Shabbos for the weekly newsletter that she puts into Beth Emet, and because I've read some of her stuff, she's 100% right. And for those to say about how you're usher to play music on Shabbos or whatever on instruments, you're incorrect. Because if you look back in the times of Chazal and the Beis Hamikdash, what happened with the Levine and the Beis Hamikdash? They used to play instruments on Shabbos in the Beis Hamikdash as part of Tefillah. So what happened back in the day that now all of a sudden people are saying it's us and Misaper to go play instruments on Shabbos during shul? There's no halacha that says it. It became a tradition from the Rabbanon, to aser, playing instruments on Shabbos, which is nothing wrong with doing. which I know that you would agree with me too, because again, this is what the conservative movement represents, is the fact it's adding in what the Beis Hamikdash really was. And so it's what.
Yeah, I fully agree with you ashkafically. I'm worried that, like, for social reasons, right, for like fighting a shidduch and things like that, the conservative movement is not a great place for that, because like, just people are so much older and like.
Oh, I didn't say that I was looking for a conservative girl per se.
No, but I'm saying to meet somebody, right? So let's say Shabbat morning, you're going to shul. Even if hashkafically you might disagree a little bit with what's happening, right, in modern Orthodox communities, right?
I'm going to tell you straight out. I'm going to tell you straight out right now. I'm not going to find my shidduch in Florida. If anything, I'll find it in Israel.
Okay, got it.
I'm not going to be here because
Why?
Because the Shadchanim. I don't know if you know Bela Seabrow. She's world-renowned speaker and matchmaker in New York, who I was with in Eretz Israel for Sukkot. And basically, she tried setting me up with a few girls here in the States. And basically, they said the minute they were interested, but then the minute they found out that I was making Aliyah, they're like, I'm not interested anymore, because they didn't want to go to Israel. So then that's when she came out and said, look, once you get there to Israel and your Aliyah is complete and you're there permanently, whatever, call me and I'll help you. She finds a shidduchim like that. The minute she looks at your profile, she's able to match you right. She has connections throughout the globe. She has people all over, including in Israel. She already had found somebody originally